Hi, it's Susan from Worldpeacefull, and I'm going to read some information about Australia. Today's Australia Day. I don't typically have great interest in celebrating Australia Day, and it's not because I don't love my country, I do. Many Australians are not really that patriotic. Many will celebrate for the sake of a party, and it's very much the Australian character. We're really not that nationalistic. It's probably come from our sort of easygoing, natures really, and the roots of where we've come from in respect of the convicts that came out here. Many of us were from Irish and Scottish heritage. Many were the ones who were stolen on the street and sent to Australia. This is our lineage. So we were the petty criminals that came out to Australia. So we don't really identify with nobility. We don't really identify with class. We haven't. I mean, it's starting to change now because we're having other influences coming into our country. But Australia really embodied much of what many other countries would have loved. And I know when I was in England, half the people wanted to come out to Australia because they wanted an easier life. They found it very negative over there. So with that, what I might do is just do a little intro into sort of the beginning here in Australia for the white Anglo-Saxons who came. I also want to acknowledge the traditional stewards. I don't call them owners myself because I know the traditional Indigenous were not owning anything. That's typically the capitalist sort of narrative is owners. They're not. Nobody actually owns any country. But the traditional stewards I pay my deepest respects to because they really embodied living in harmony with the natural world, as do all Indigenous people on the planet. Those who see themselves as sophisticated and civilised have actually not lived in harmony with the natural systems. Yes, they've mastered science and technology, but they haven't mastered human relationships amongst each other, as we're still having wars and conflicts and trade conflicts, which is not really a sign of a civilised society at this point. So I pay my respects to those who truly, deeply listen to the land, who felt themselves to be one with the land, who became still enough to listen deeply. It is in the deep listening that we come to know Australia. So let's go to Australian history from the perspective of white Anglo-Saxon. On the 1st of January 1901, the first day of the 20th century, the 6 Australian colonies were at last united in a new nation that had been foreseen for generations as the most probable outcome of British settlement of the continent in 1788. Australia in 1901 was arguably the world's most liberal and democratic state, based as it had been on a settlement at the time of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, and therefore commencing as a nation free of much of the old world's baggage of medieval regulation, entrenched social classes and state churches. Through the 19th century, Australia had developed without the poisonous legacy of revolutionary upheaval of the kind that had divided and weighed down France, nor of the slavery that had led to the Civil War in America, nor of the military conquest and deep cultural conflicts of Canada. James Bryce, perhaps the leading British constitutional expert of the day and a frequent source of reference during Australia's constitutional conventions, said of the new Australian Constitution, "It represents the high watermark of popular government. It is penetrated by the spirit of a democracy. In Australia, the people, through their legislator, with its short term, are not only supreme, but can, by their legislator, control of the executive, give effect to their wishes with incomparable promptitude. That's a funny word. So I'll just read that little bit because I didn't read it quite correctly. So are not only supreme, but can, by their legislators, control. So the legislator is where they make the laws. This is the parliament. It's control of the executive, given effect to the wishes with incomparable promptitude. Bryce thought that at Federation Australia was more democratic than Britain because it had not inherited Britain's oligarchical habits. And oligarchical is sort of like concentration of wealth. In an oligarchy, it's large and a few oligarchic influences, if you like, political as well as social. He also thought it was more democratic than America because both the states and the union were fettered by many constitutional restrictions, and because wealth has there, as indeed in Britain, also been able to exert a control, nonetheless potent because half concealed. So this is really important. But essentially what's being said here is that Australia's democracy was far better than the British or the United States because we didn't have all this baggage from establishment. We were a new country. And there wasn't this control and concentration of wealth, nor secrecy. Institutions of representative and responsible government on democratic foundations were not new to Australia in 1901. They had been established in the 1850s, and the democratic spirit had pervaded both the institutions and the policies of the colonial governments. Australia had pioneered the secret ballot and was among the first to adopt universal male suffrage. So this is voting. So we were amongst the first to adopt the vote for men, in this case for men. Universal primary education for boys and girls, secular universities, land reform, a free press, a legal framework for private enterprise and capital mobilisation, legalisation of trade unions, vast infrastructure development, invention and rapid adoption of new technology, including cable links across the globe, planned garden cities, and perhaps the highest real incomes in the world had all been achieved. Indeed, even before democracy, liberal ideas and socially advanced policies had found powerful advocates. So in Australia, there is a really strong feeling for democracy, probably far stronger really than the United States and in Britain. We may not talk about our democracy, and many people may not even really understand their democracy, but we've internalized it. We've been free. We know freedom, probably better than anyone. And what I particularly like about this is that we were prime movers on universal education that was free for boys and girls. We're at secular universities, so these are not religious universities. We don't have religious people embedded in those universities. This was about freedom. It was about not having bias. You know, it was a lightening up. It was a real pioneering forward of, you know, a much better type of society. Now, he goes on to say that those who had written the Constitution were satisfied with their handiwork. The first Prime Minister, Edmund Barton, it's actually a suburb in Canberra, I might add, the New South Wales lawyer and politician, who had led the drafting of the final version, asked at the final session of the convention on 17th of March 1898, "Is this a constitution which will enable a free people to come together and in community together to work out their own destiny?" I just want to repeat that, to work out our own destiny. Who can deny it? Is it a constitution which gives all reasonable and liberal guarantees of freedom? It's not a question of freedom for who, it's a freedom for the people. That can only be answered in one way. I might just state too that when I was at Parliament last time I was in Canberra, I noticed Edmund Barton's photograph and I saw Scott Morrison's right next to it, and I wondered whether that was depicting the first Prime Minister and the last Prime Minister. My hope is it doesn't. My hope is we have other Prime Ministers, because I do not want to lose our constitutional democracy. I don't want Australia to unravel its democratic framework. I want the rights of the Australian people to be strengthened, in actual fact. Now, Alfred Deakin, who would be 3 times Prime Minister, was eloquent about the liberal character of the document, by which he meant not only the protection of minorities, but also the flexibility and opportunity it provided for Australians in the years to come to realise their aspirations. Not the aspirations of a ruling class, but actually realising their own aspirations as free people. What a charter of liberty is embraced within this bill, of political liberty and religious liberty. So freedom of religion was already enshrined within the Australian Constitution. There is no need to strengthen religious freedom in this country. We have freedom of religion, and there is embodied within our society an acceptance of the diversity of all religion, but we're also a secular society, which means we're not governed by religion. We are governed by non-religious approaches to governance, because that's more inclusive of everybody, and it doesn't change the character and nature of who we are as Australians, which is not only tolerant, we're accepting of all diversity. We're accepting of all religion and non-religion. We don't say you need to believe what we believe. We say you have a right to believe what you want. And that is the Australian character. He goes on to say, and this is the part that particularly interests me, a Charter of Liberty is enshrined in this Constitution, which is also a Charter of Peace. Of peace, it's repeated. Order and good government for the whole of the people, whom it will embrace and unite. So we come under our Constitution in unity with each other. No one is excluded from our constitutional citizens' rights. The new nation moved quickly to ensure the political equality of women at the ballot box. Women had been inspired not only by the opportunities that had been opened by universal primary education and the possibilities of democratic institutions, but also by the uncompromising idea of equality between the sexes that John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor had articulated in their opposition to what they had called the subjugation of women, or subjection of women. The rigid legal and social roles for men and women that had been consolidated in the Victorian era were already breaking down as universal primary education embraced girls as well as boys. Now, what's interesting about that statement is actually having little boys and little girls being educated together. Now, it raises questions in my mind about religious education where boys and girls are separated, and then they are educated in such a way that is different from the rest. I personally am no fan of schools that have specific religious denominations. My interest as an Australian would be schools teaching all religions so that children get to choose, because we don't want to divide our country. We want everybody to come together and be experiencing the same education. And of course, if they want to specialise in Catholic education at university or Buddhist education, or Christian, or any other form of Christian or Islam or whatever, that's fine, do it. But everyone has to be educated, in my opinion, at the early ages with the same education. And it has to be inclusive of all religion, all different political persuasions, all different cultures, Indigenous history as well, so that we're all coming at this life embracing everybody. That's my interest. The minute we start to hive off into areas without that universal knowledge, we then become I'm a this and you're a that, and we don't want that. That's where division gets planted. And then people get favoured on the basis of, particular schools that they've been to. And this is what we've seen in Australia. Through private education, they got the best education through particular denominations. Nobody should get a better education than other people on the basis of income. Because what we do with that is we end up truncating the great talent that's in this country. People, because they've gone to a public school, are not seen at the interview as someone who's well educated. And yet they could be brilliant. You could be looking at an Einstein sitting in front of you, Mary Curie. You could be looking at Joan of Arc, whatever. Some great scientist could be sitting in front of you who's at a public school education. And public here in Australia is government funded. But because of the marketing and money that's injected into the private school system, they get better teachers. They get better technologies. They get better opportunities. They go travelling overseas. And this is where the seed of division gets planted, and I'm no fan of that. As I said, I have no issue with people specialising later on and having your private schools and so forth, but that we have to come from an equal basis is my opinion. So going back to the female universal, the idea of universal education producing really the environment for gender equality is very exciting to read about, because the female is definitely not understood and she's seen in a different light, and it's not true. There's great potential in both boys and girls. I'm into merit myself. I don't care whether you're a boy or a girl. I'm interested, in, okay, what is it that you love? What is it that you can do? What is it that you want? What's your aspiration? Your gender shouldn't matter at all. In fact, you shouldn't even be aware of gender. You're selecting people. But unfortunately, because we've been in a society that's favoured males, it's all over the world, of course, again, that great talent gets truncated because of prejudices, which need not be there. So going back to what happened here in Australia, women such as Edith Cohen, Annette Bear, Helen Spence, Isabella Goldstein and Hilma Parks had already organised to promote their political causes of women's health and education, protection through temperance of women and children against violence in the family. See, domestic violence was happening back then. We've got a major problem with it now. So male violence hasn't been dealt with. That needs to be sorted out. I'm just going to go still on that. I typically go still when I start to get inspiration. So just bear with me a moment. Women have been held down because there's been this sense of men wanting to be the provider, wanting to be in control, wanting to provide for their family, and this idea of protector. But there's also an issue of superiority sitting there on the table, which actually masks inferiority because of the battle of the sexes. Because women are also very competent, particularly, women are very great organisers. And women are very strong-minded too. They have strengths in different areas to men. And often men, as boys, are raised to look down on women or girls. I know that from my own school education. We were constantly put down by the boys. And boys were inappropriate too, sexually. And they often took centre stage, whereas the girls kind of sat in the background. They were more boisterous. And there's a misconception about boys being boisterous and girls being petite. We're not. Girls can be just as boisterous as boys, but we tend to get much more social pressure to be ladylike. I know when I was young, cross your legs. We weren't allowed to be as free as boys, so we tended to suppress ourselves. And so there's a real misconception around females. We also had to look pretty in order to be liked or valued. It's very sad that happened, but the males wanted pretty girls. And so those girls were valued over the girls that were a bit plump or, not as pretty. So they weren't valued as people. And it's a real disappointment when you see that going on. I actually had friends I walked with years ago, I remember, in Sydney, who got barked at by these guys. They didn't even know them, but they barked at them as if they were dogs. And I just looked at the males and I just went, to be honest, I actually ran after them. I got angry. A bit of a hothead. But I was just incensed. It was like, how dare you? You just put these girls down because of the way they look. You don't even know who they are. I mean, how shallow is that? And these guys were no oil paintings themselves. So this gap between the male and the female has been created in order for males to feel superior to females for a long period of time. And it's not just here in Australia, it's right across the world. They were pregnant with babies. They had no power. They didn't have their own money. And this is where the suffragette movement really arose from, was the powerlessness that women felt. There was also rape and marriage, women being beaten up. Obviously, we're physically not as strong, but that doesn't mean we're weak. And there's also this insulting term of calling, a boy a girl if he seems to be crying or showing signs of humanity. It is the biggest lie, is to put down a boy because he's expressing his feelings, because he's crying. And just as a bit of information for people, did you know that boys are in the feminine until they reach puberty? We've got XXXY chromosomes. The boys are in the feminine before they hit testosterone, which is puberty, and when the real male part of them kicks in. That's why boys are very feminine before they hit puberty. So when they're picked on as being a girl, it's totally wrong. They're in the feminine at that time, and they're extremely sensitive. And then they're learning to tough it up, to man up, to disregard their feelings, to suppress emotions because it's seen as female. Now, from a female perspective, that's incredibly insulting, to say to a guy that you feel like a female, you're weak. How do you think we feel when we hear that? It's like, what a load of rubbish is that? Strength to show your feelings. To show vulnerability is probably the greatest courage I've ever seen. And I personally, when I see it in males, where they actually show that they care, that I find very inspiring. They're the men I tend to respect. I'm not interested in men that are completely walled off, because they don't make good partners. They don't feel the other partner. They don't feel empathy. So these leading pioneers of female empowerment here in Australia, they really have emerged out of this disenfranchisement of females. So this goes on to talk about, by federation, women had been accorded the right to vote and stand for election in South Australia in 1895, Western Australia in 1899, and the new National Parliament would soon, in 1902, legislate for votes for women in Commonwealth elections and for the right to stand for Parliament. Australia's First Peoples received limited attention in debates on the draft constitution. And this, of course, is a big shame for Australia, and it may well be reflective of the British imperialism, the colonisation, the fact that the Indigenous were seen as primitive savages, they were called, and they were not respected as people with great lived knowledge of how to live with nature. Because of the technology and the education, there was a separation that happened there, again, of superiority and inferiority. The Indigenous are actually in the feminine, and you'll find that when you look at these sort of left-brain societies, these Western societies that have very high degree of science and technology, they typically are in the left brain. And again, not unlike the female disempowerment, the Indigenous also experienced discrimination where they were not viewed as equal. The unambiguous rule of the British Enlightenment settlement had been that Aboriginal people had all the rights of British citizens. Aboriginal men from the establishment of self-government as British citizens had the vote, had used it intermittently in New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia and Tasmania, and had the right to vote for delegates to the constitutional conventions. But the inability of the colonial governments to enforce the principle of legal equality, see, that was, I think, debated in respect of the US slavery bill. Because I remember in that film called Lincoln, there was the talk, this is where they're trying to abolish slavery. And I think the Democrat there, who was well known for his views on equality, he had to embrace legal equality because other people thought that the African Americans were inferior and they couldn't accept that they were socially equal or biologically equal. And in certain quarters, this argument raises its head as in equality of outcome is undesirable. I've heard this come up in religious narratives, and it's masking a belief that we are unequal, and it's untrue. We are different, same but different, yes. We're not equivalent in respect of, let's say, males and females' strength. We may be not equivalent in education, but as we are all human, we all have infinite potential to be as good as each other. But that requires the opportunity to develop oneself on a level playing field, and prejudice skews that playing field. It favours some over others, and this is the weakness of established societies that have built their wealth on inequality. And this is often not narrated in textbooks. It's not narrated in classrooms. It's not robustly discussed. But it's essential that truth be laid on the table, because the reality is we're not unequal. No one is. An Indigenous person is not unequal to me. In fact, I look at people on the basis of whether they're loving or not, but even those who are not loving, I don't see them as unequal. I just see them as not able to experience the true beauty of life because they're not loving the world, they feel unhappy. But that's really a state of emotional suppression, which filters the way they see the world. It changes what they see. So perception changes based on that inner state. So it talks about legal equality, that this was not enforced by colonial governments, and to protect Aborigines from the hostility of many settlers. In Tasmania, they were actually wiped out. They were treated like vermin. They were poisoned because they killed off some of the sheep and the cattle for food. We did not know, or our forefathers, let's say, did not know how to make peace with the Indigenous. And also there's the issue of terra nullius in all this. Captain Cook was not supposed to land if there was inhabitants in Australia. He was not authorised to land, and yet he did. And that's why today we have Indigenous people rising up to say that we consider this invasion day, the 26th of January. They didn't concede their country, and they have a definite point there. And of course, nobody really wants to give that any weight because they don't want the land taken, because we trade land, and yet no one owns it. And this is where all the confusion and conflict happens, and then the suppression of the voice of people. So it goes on to say that there was this hostility of many settlers, and this led to the erosion of liberties and rights by protection regimes. So we had protectorates where, as the Indigenous became more disenfranchised, they moved from their traditional lands. And you see, they're not all one group. They have skin names. They have country that they have claimed as their own country, and there's real rules between Aboriginal tribes as to whether they have permission to come onto that land. But from the European perspective, they just think they're all one group, and they moved them off their lands. It's like moving a baby from its mother. And then they became, in a sense, displaced. And there was deliberate displacement through religion too. The missionaries came in to teach them to be civilized human beings because they believed their God was the only God. And this is where religion is problematic. There was no respect for these people's beliefs, such as the dreaming. These people were totally in tune with that higher power, completely in tune. They had myths around it. Some people might say, well, we don't get that and we don't believe that. Well, that's fine. It's called freedom. But when a peoples have lived on a land for 50,000 years, I think they know something about their harmony with that land, and that land is that higher power. Of course, people don't want to move from their beliefs based on books. These people didn't need books. They were one with the nature. The nature is the God, or is the higher power. They didn't even need that, really, because they were absolutely part of it. They were part of nature. They were part of God. But this is, I guess, where people were at that time too, just ignorance. And the Christian missionaries would have been going there thinking they were saving people because that's what they believed. They were trying to save their souls. They were frightened of hell. And that's how religion took root. So the Indigenous people became wards of the state, and there was an Aboriginal protectorate in government who was like the parent of the Indigenous people. Many of them were on missions. They got rounded up and put on missions. So then they slowly were losing their traditional skills of hunting and gathering, their history. In some of the missions, I think, if not all, they weren't allowed to speak their own language. This was a form of cultural genocide that happened. This is part of the Australian history. And on Australia Day, I'm, in a sense, having a narrative around all of it, because all Australians are celebrated on this day, inclusive of the Indigenous Australians. Could even make the connection to Gondwanaland, this very, very ancient land that we sit and stand upon, live upon, is an extraordinary land. I felt the energy of this country when I travelled around Australia. It was incredible. And, it's had all sorts of tumultuous upheavals, but it's a very amazing land. And I'm sure the Indigenous know it far better than what we do. So in this story, it goes on to say it's been agreed by the founders that the states should continue to be responsible for policy affecting Indigenous people, or Aboriginal people, they called them. In Queensland, the Elections Act of 1885 specifically excluded Aboriginal natives from voting. Well, that's definitely discrimination. But those with mixed European and Aboriginal parentage could vote at the discretion of the electoral officials. So that's a way of getting them to integrate into the white society and not valuing them as equal citizens, British citizens who are of a different ethnic background. From 1893, Western Australia had similar discrimination, When most women were given the vote in 1902, Aboriginal women were guaranteed their right only if it had already been accorded to them in a state as it had in South Australia. The new Commonwealth Act could entrench state restrictions. Although foreseen, the establishment of the new nation was nonetheless a political triumph, resulting neither from war nor revolution, but from complete civil politics of the 6 separate liberal democratic polities, the Australias as they were sometimes called before Federation. That had come into existence during the preceding 112 years. During this time, the Australians, working together across colonial boundaries, had forced Britain to abandon the transportation of convicts and secured the right to govern themselves. So we are a nation of convicts. As I said in the opening of this video, we've come from the streets. We've come from the homeless. We've come from the unemployed. We've come from the marginalised. That is the roots of Australia. We've not come from privilege. That's why there's a real toughness here in this country, because there's a memory of hardship. And, you know, certainly recently with the fires, the poor farmers, they go through hardship. Not unlike farmers in other countries, of course. You'll find in the sort of middle to lower socioeconomic classes, it's a hard life. And it humbles you because you don't get full of yourself. You don't go around saying, I'm better than you. Look at my flashy car, you know. I personally have not come from that background. I've come from, you know, a background where we joked together, mucked around. We saw everyone as equal. I would talk to a CEO as soon as talk to someone who's a clerk. You know, it's like no big deal. When I went to England, I really saw the class system in operation, and I couldn't understand it. So if I wanted something done, I'd go to the manager. I always go to the top, even now. And it's because I feel equal. I'm not going, oh, no, I better go low. Why would I? And that's come from my education as an Australian. That's my culture. So when I see people positioning themselves as better than others because of their status, it's actually hard for me to fathom. It's like, you're not better than me. I don't care how much money you got, you know? And the same applies for people who are in poverty too, who have a bit of a chip on their shoulders. It's like, well, you have to sort that out. You know, we're not going to carry you either. Like it's a bit of both ways. It's like we kind of have a culture of, yeah, you got to get up and fend for yourself. That is true. And I know I've grown up with this, you know, where you sink or swim on your own, you know, on your own application. We tend to be very independent and we give it a go. That is Australia. We're also kind to those who are down and out too. We will help them because we might be there ourselves. It's like the middle class is not far from, you know, eking out a living in that lower socioeconomic or poverty class. We don't even really like the word class. See, I'm not even comfortable with the word. Don't like it. And I'm not comfortable when I see those doing really, really well and those doing really, really badly, because there's a part of me that knows that we should be all trekking on a similar trajectory. But when you start to see really intense shifts of wealth to the higher socioeconomic, and you see the real pauperisation or casualisation of those in very sort of inflexible, you know, they're in jobs that you've got to take it or leave it. And often there's poor conditions. They might well just be called up and say, come to work, but they don't have any holiday pay. So when you get pauperised, you get really pauperised now. But when I was sort of growing up in the 60s and the 70s, people were doing it tough. That's true back even then. But everyone was pretty much trekking in the same sort of, area, like most of us were earning roughly the same. There still was the privileged class, and there was always a resentment in the middle class. But I think that's the same everywhere in the world, to be honest. I think people do get resentment because they feel it's unfair and they're suffering. And there may well be a bit of blame going towards those who look like they're doing really well, or a bit of jealousy. And it says here, so the new Commonwealth Act could entrench state restrictions. This is to do with Indigenous women. Although foreseen, the establishment of the new nation was nonetheless a political triumph, resulting neither from war nor revolution, but from the complete civil politics, as I said before, complex civil politics. So this is great. This country's not been established out of war. That's why we're not into it. And it goes on to say, as I've reread before, that the Australias, which were the colonies before Federation, had come into existence during the preceding 112 years. So people forget about that. There's a real history even prior to 1901. During this time, the Australians, working together across colonial boundaries, had forced Britain to abandon the transportation of convicts. And that's where I was sort of talking about before. And secured the right to govern themselves. So independence is what we're seeking. Each of the 6 self-governing colonies had fostered in its citizens a distinct identity and political tradition, yet each had been built around common values and ideals, based on unprecedented levels of economic and civil freedom. Each colony had developed a multiplicity of interests, producing a different political balance within each. The 4 smaller colonies had to be persuaded that coming together in a united country would not result in their domination by the 2 larger ones in population. That's New South Wales and Victoria. Democratic government was full of promise. The great strength of representative democracies was that their governments had the most potent of all legitimacies with which to govern and reform. The endorsement and implied consent of the people as a whole through governments formed on the basis of popular election. Such governments had authority of broad scope to tax, to spend, and to regulate. Provided governments acted within the scope of their authority and did not needlessly stir conflict by venturing into areas that trespassed unacceptably on the deeply held values and loyalties of the population, in brackets all major parts of it, and could remain free of invasion from outside, democracies could be expected to be the most stable and effective over time of all systems of government. The founders had written a constitution that contained all the institutional protections of liberty that their liberal traditions demanded, but would the policies of democratic governments be liberal? I just want to add here that we didn't have a Bill of Rights. So I'm not sure I agree with that in respect of the liberty, which is freedom. We didn't have the freedoms enshrined in a Bill of Rights. And that's a weakness in this country, sadly, because it means we can be exploited by others who may not value the Australian tradition, and by others who do not see a world based on egalitarianism, because from their cultures that they've come from, they see it as class system. And so we have some clashing cultures already emerging here in Australia. And we've also got particular sectors, such as the IT sector, firing up in a very big way as a form of transformation. So bringing in the digital technologies. But then we've got issues of privacy, data gathering. Who owns the data? Do you own your own data? Really important questions. If somebody owns your data, they can alter it. Is it okay for privacy if you're speaking on the phone about something and then you see an ad pop up Is that legitimately okay if you're having a private conversation with someone? Suddenly an ad comes up. Is that crowding out private space? And then some might argue, well, no, it's a public commons, it's telecommunications. Well, no, it's not. If I'm talking to my mother, that's between me and her. So all those others who are associated with that technology, inclusive of apps, which are corporations, do they have the right to gather up the information, which they're calling the new gold? So, Australia is moving in, and not just Australia, other countries right across the world. We're moving into a brave new world here, and it's going to challenge who we are as Australians. And because most people don't know anything about technology, they don't know what's happening. They're not being informed or educated about it, and there's certainly no referendum that's happened. So the popular will of the people have not actually accepted this technological disruption or evolution, this digital evolution where everybody's ID'd, everyone's being forced onto online, currency will disappear. We haven't been asked if we want that. And the reason the currencies will disappear is so that you're forced to use your card. And then everything you do in your life is tracked. And some will say, well, I've got nothing to hide. I know, but children will be using their cards, and so they'll be known where they are, their location. They might talk about something to do with sex, and let's say an ad comes up. We have to think through, what is the implications? Is it okay for someone to listen to your child talking to another child? Who are these people listening? Are they government? No, they're not. They're private. If they're private, who are they? What happens if they are not okay? This is all the discussion that needs to happen and is not happening because of the greed in this, because of the incentive with the money, with the investments, the technologies. Those who have already invested heavily will find anyone like myself who are raising these issues as a threat. In a democratic society, that shouldn't be happening. But it happens because business interests have already been given the green light, not democratic processes put in place to ensure the safety of people when they challenge or bring up contested ideas in a democratic free speech forum. But with others not believing in free speech, where others start to see it as it's an infringement on my ability to make money. What if they're part of a Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and then they see that you're talking about them, their profits are affected, then they sue the government? What happens with that? See, these are all subject matters that need to be put on the table before these things go further. The public has a right to know, definitely, because their lives are being impacted. And really the whole democratic rationale is about that. It's about the best social ordering, the most stable of government has occurred when you've allowed people freedom of speech, because then they feel they've got some control over their lives. They've got a say over things that impact them. It's like you conducting, for example, a mediation with people, getting people to talk about an issue, a problem. If they don't talk and they start just putting the other party down because that party's not turning up the way they think they should, and they don't listen to people unless they confirm their worldview, I'm right, you're wrong, no respect, that creates the semblance of an enemy, and it creates a division. When we instill democratic values and we say, well, I may not like what you are saying, but you have the right to say it. These sort of philosophies have come about to enable diversity of viewpoints to come onto the table. It's absolutely essential we have the diversity, because there's things you don't think about that another can bring up. But rather than seeing it as a threat, you invite that diversity in because they're your helpful teacher. In mediation, very often when two parties come together who've been at loggerheads and haven't had healthy dialogue where potential for harm can happen. Once they enter into a dialogue with a mediator, they start to see what they were thinking about was not necessarily true once they hear the other party speak. And then new information comes to them and go, oh, okay, I didn't realise that was what you were thinking. Or, okay, I'm being challenged here. This is life challenging me. Maybe there's something about this I haven't thought through. Maybe there's an opportunity in this. Not as a means of manipulating or spin, but as a means of innovating, as a means of accommodating others who are part of the story, the life story. We're all in this together. So I felt to say that because I can see changes afoot and I can see that we're not understanding the true nature of democracy. And Australia was one of the leading democracies. The time when I was growing up here, we had free public transport, Medicare. There was no insurance, anything. But I'm seeing creeping in to the commercial narrative, insurance. I can see the American system coming into Australia, which I don't think is a good thing, particularly for those in lower socioeconomic areas, because we've seen what's happened in the States. There's tent cities. We're seeing the poor man can't access, emergency help because he's not insured or she's not insured. We don't want that because it becomes a user's pay right to good health, a user's pay right to accessing services. You have to pay for it. If you want the best medical care, you need better insurance. Well, we don't want that. We want every single Australian under an egalitarian ethos to be able to access quality healthcare. People go, oh, socialism. No, it's not. It's practical. You've got a whole society with divergent needs and interests, and some have, disabilities, some are aged. There's all sorts of drama. Some are having traumas. Some have had car accidents. Some are depressed. It's called life. It's got nothing to do with the imported ideological prejudices of other countries who think in terms of any form of social organising as a threat to a capitalist ideology. It's not. This is a social democratic country, and that's one of its strengths. And if we're really serious about what the people want, which I don't think some people are, but if there was a renewal around true democracy, then you have to invite the public into these discussions. And it's not just a marketing exercise to convince people that something is inevitable. It's a real debate. And in these early parliaments here in Australia, we had debates. People were debating, and they might say, well, we're still debating in Parliament now. Yes and no, they're pretty contrived debates. We're certainly not inviting in the public. And I think the public do need to be able to put questions to the parliamentarians at question time at Parliament, not sitting there gagged up in the, what do they call it, up in the gallery. We shouldn't be sitting there without any say. We should be able to get a microphone and say, okay, Minister, blah, blah, I would like to say this. Absolutely, I understand if someone goes on too long, you ring a bell and they have to stop because people get passionate. But we create public forums everywhere so everybody has a say and they can get it out. And then they can chat to each other. But unfortunately, what we've got here is certain interests who don't want that input because they want to keep going. They don't want to be interrupted. They want it to be efficient. Let's get this implemented. And that's typically the mindset within corporate entities who don't have to consult democratically their staff members. So they are also in a mindset, and we have to be careful about this because they don't understand democratic process, collaborative process. And that's where the clash is. So it's something to consider. So I might stop it there just as a bit of an introduction and a reflection. And of course, my view is just another perspective. There are 17 or probably 23 million views out there. So may this have been constructive and helpful. On that note, I will say goodbye and happy Australia Day. And for the Indigenous people, maybe we need to think up another day that respects your stewardship. And yes, this was definitely occupied country. This is your country. And yes, there's still more work to be done in respect of how we work this thing through from a peace perspective, and to honour the First Peoples, without doubt, who have in their background the keys to sustainability for us in the future, for all of us. Their knowledge is extensive. So I will leave it there. Thanks. Bye.